Good evening and welcome. I'm Jean-Paul Gabriel, the Lucas Fellow and Tutor in Early Modern History here at Balliol, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you back for another Balliol online lecture. I'm here in Staircase 18 in the college, and it's a great pleasure to have with us tonight our speaker, Heather Sharkey. Professor Sharkey is Professor of Modern Middle Eastern and North African History at the University of Pennsylvania, but she's been spending a year sabbatical with us here at Balliol this year as the visiting Oliver Smithies Visiting Fellow for all of the academic year 2024 to 2025. Now, Heather is a distinguished scholar whose work ranges widely across histories of empire, colonialism, religion, mainly in Sudan, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire, but thinking also more widely about a historian who has been working across the history of world Christianity, interfaith relations, and especially intercommunal relations in the Middle East. I mentioned, for example, this incredible book of hers, this study called The History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, published in 2017 by Cambridge University Press, which I recommend to all of you. The work is distinctive in offering a book that stretches across chronology all the way back to the 7th century in thinking about relations between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and the larger questions around religious diversity in the Middle East. And it's a book that's unique as well for getting beyond the things we normally focus on, religion, theology, politics, to also thinking about everyday life, food, marriage practices, living patterns, urban life. And so all of that is just one reason why we've all really been energized by Heather's presence here during her sabbatical, during which she's been working on a new book that we'll get a taste of this evening. And the title of the talk is The Sudanese Giraffe Who Went to France, The Life and Afterlife of Zarafa, 1824 to 2024. And I'll hand it over to Heather in a second, but just to remind everyone about the format, we'll have a lecture from Heather, and after that, we'll have a good amount of time for discussion, for Q&A, and at any point in the lecture, you're very welcome to submit a question via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can wait to do so till after the lecture. But what I'll do when I moderate at the end is to sit there and raise the questions and put them to Heather for further discussion. So with that, welcome to all of you, and especially to thank and welcome Heather for being with us this evening.
Hello, everybody. And thank you, John Paul, for that generous introduction. I am thrilled to be here. It is an honor and a privilege to be at Balliol this year and at Oxford. I've been having a fantastic time. The conversations are intellectually exhilarating every day. And again, it's a real privilege to be here in Oxford and also to be speaking to you all tonight. I have some slides, and so I'm going to share those as I begin. And let me just bring that up here. And I'll go back and let me put this on the slideshow mode. Okay, here we go. So can you all sound okay? You can hear me, right? Okay, good. Tonight, I propose to recount the life story of a giraffe. Not just any giraffe, but one in particular, Zarafa, whose name means giraffe in Arabic. She was born in 1824 in the Sudan and died in Paris in 1845. Zarafa went on to have many afterlives and remains a source of fascination in France and among giraffe history buffs worldwide. Zarafa is one of 7 figures and the only non-human featured in the book that I'm writing this year about global microhistory in the Nile Valley from 1820 to 1970. Balliol's John Paul Gabriel, who I'm very grateful to for moderating this event, has written the best overview that I know on global microhistory. Taking this approach means starting with small events, details, objects, and people, often ordinary and not famous people, or with modest and scattered sources, that's the micro, and examining them closely to connect them to larger developments or ideas, the macro. What makes microhistory global is that the stories cross long distances and happen on the world stage. In this case, as I hope to convince you, we can pursue a global microhistory of Zarafa to see bigger issues in diplomatic, environmental and scientific, and cultural history that connect the Sudan and Egypt to France and beyond. I came face to face with Zarafa, or rather with her stuffed skin, in 2012 after taking a wrong turn and walking down a side staircase in the Natural History Museum of La Rochelle, a beautiful town on France's Atlantic coast, which I was visiting for the first time. She was standing in the stairwell because she was too tall to fit into the main exhibit rooms. The brass plaque at her feet stopped me in my tracks. Giraffe, it said in French, of Darfur, referring to the westernmost part of today's Sudan. A gift from the Pasha of Egypt, it said. She lived for 17 and a half years in the Menagerie, meaning the Jardin des Plantes of Paris. By that time, I had already written a lot about Sudanese history, and so lots of questions popped into my head. Did the Sudan have much connection to France? I knew of a few French travelers' accounts, but until that time I had considered the ties to be tenuous, since Britain, not France, had seized the Sudan amid the colonial scramble for Africa and remained influential after decolonization in 1956. Then, too, of all possible gifts for Muhammad Ali Pasha to send to France in the 1820s, why a giraffe? And if she had lived in the Paris menagerie, then how did her stuffed body end up in this stairwell hundreds of miles away? Finally, could a giraffe come from Darfur or from anywhere else in the Sudan? Countries like Kenya and South Africa had giraffes, I knew, but Sudan? This encounter and these questions launched the inquiry that led me to write this book. Her story prompted me to consider connections between the Nile Valley and France, and more broadly, the workings of diplomacy between leaders and among larger publics, the rise of zoos and faunal extinctions, the history of wildlife in Northeast Africa, and the possibility of treating a giraffe like Zarafa as an agent of history, a she and not an it. Before I turn to Zarafa's story, let me say a few words about this last point. Scholars have been rethinking the place of non-human animals in history. In 1987, Harriet Ritvo, who was a colleague in one of my first jobs at MIT, published an agenda-setting book called The Animal Estate: The English and Other Creatures in the Victorian Age, which studied how 19th century Britons modeled hierarchies of dominance at home and in the empire through practices like tracing dog and horse pedigrees. Others followed by writing, for example, about 19th century French bourgeois attachments to dogs and cats as house pets. The field has continued to grow while reflecting environmental anxieties. The debut in 2024, just last year, of a new journal called Animal History, published by the University of California Press, devoted to histories of human-animal relationships and non-human pasts, suggests that research has reached a new level. In studying Zarafa, I have drawn insights as well from scholars who connect humans to other animals such as horses in what the biologist Linda Burke and anthropologist Carilli Thompson call social actors within shared interspecies networks. I'm intrigued by the efforts of the late zoologist and giraffe expert Anne Innes-Dagg to study the social lives of mammals and birds and their capacity for animal friendships. Finally, I aspire to model a history that can contribute towards understanding what the philosopher and ecologist David Abram has called the more than human world. So, without further ado, let's turn to Zarafa. We know that Muhammad Ali Pasha, who ruled Egypt from 1805 to 1848, and whose forces had conquered the Sudan in 1821, ordered her capture as a gift for Charles X, King of France. I'll say more soon about why he did this, but for now, let me say a bit about how. Contrary to what the plaque says in La Rochelle, she could not have come from Darfur. That journey would have been too long and difficult through desert terrain. Other sources say Sennar, a town southeast of Khartoum, or closer to the border with Ethiopia, which seems credible because she must have come from near the Nile. We know that her two Sudanese caregivers loaded her onto a boat which sailed to Egypt, and they would have started from just, if you see these maps here, you see Khartoum, and starting probably on the Blue Nile, heading, towards Ethiopia there, and then they would have gone down the Nile there, stopping along the way to circumvent the rocky patches or cataracts in Nubia. Passing Cairo, she reached the Mediterranean coast, where she boarded a ship at Alexandria and sailed west to Marseille. After resting for the winter, she, her caretakers, and two milk cows set out in May 1827 on a road heading north in France. They walked for weeks. At each town, she caused a sensation because she was the first live giraffe to set foot in France. A painting now in the Art Museum of Beaune in Burgundy wine country captures her during this journey. In Paris, she met Charles X and then settled into the public menagerie, which was founded in 1794 after the French Revolution to house creatures rescued from the royal palace at Versailles, next to the Museum of Natural History, where zoologists, botanists, and anatomists did their research. So, why a giraffe and why for France? In 1925, the sociologist Marcel Mauss published what became a famous essay called The Gift. Reflecting on the potlatch ceremonies of the Pacific Northwest American peoples, Mauss advanced a theory of gift giving, how it works, and what it does to build relationships. The anthropologist Mary Douglas, who was, by the way, a graduate of St. Anne's College here in Oxford, and who did her DPhil with the famous anthropologist, Pitt Rivers museum collector, and Sudan expert E. Evans Pritchard, she later summarized Mauss's argument in 3 short words: no free gifts. Reciprocity is essential. Effective gifts have strings attached. A gift that does nothing to enhance solidarity, she explained, channeling Mauss, is a contradiction, or I would say just a flop. Muhammad Ali Pasha would have agreed. The whole point of sending Zarafa to Charles X was to strengthen an alliance with France. Zarafa followed a long line across history of rare creatures sent for diplomatic purposes with the goal of dazzling recipients. Examples include the zebra that Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, or Saladin, the anti-crusader general, sent to his former master in Syria in 1173, the long-haired white bear, which was possibly a polar bear, that Friedrich II, Holy Roman Emperor, sent to one of Saladin's successors, El-Malik el-Kamel, in Egypt, and the white elephant that King Manuel I of Portugal sent to Giovanni de' Medici upon his installation as Pope Leo X in 1513. Egypt's rulers had been trying to send giraffes to European and Asian peers since antiquity. Giraffes were the most impressive gift they could give, and the Sudan was their only source. It would have been the source, for example, of the giraffe that Julius Caesar paraded in Rome in 46 BCE. Giraffes had gone extinct in Egypt itself well before the reigns of the pharaohs Queen Hatshepsut and King Tutankhamun, when artists rendered them in friezes. And while giraffes of various subspecies existed in Western and Southern Africa, transporting giraffes and keeping them alive was hard. The Sudan, at least, had the Nile. But even then, giraffe zones were contracting. And perhaps for this reason, no giraffes reached Egypt after 1595, at least not until the 1820s, when this story begins. Muhammad Ali knew that France, Britain, and the other European powers were competing for influence, and that they were trying to outdo each other in a cultural arms race, which included, for example, securing ancient Egyptian mummies, sculptures, and whatnot for institutions like the Louvre and the British Museum. One European dealer who was active in this race, an Italian named Drovetti, also dealt in rare animals. Drovetti suggested the giraffe idea to Muhammad Ali, and he, agreeing, sent orders to the Sudan. In fact, Muhammad Ali demanded not just one giraffe, but 4. He wanted a magnificent gift for the Ottoman Empire, which was his employer, France, the United Kingdom, and Austria. He tried first to give one to Mahmud II, the Sultan known for initiating the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century. But this giraffe died in 1823 while sailing into Istanbul. Authorities claimed a shipwreck, but the real cause was starvation. This failure offered lessons, since when it came time to procure Zarafa, feeding her became a priority. Next, Muhammad Ali tried for Charles X. But this time, when the British consul Henry Salt heard about it, he clamored for one too. And so, during the hunt that caught Zarafa, hunters captured another female who went to London as a gift for George IV. George kept the giraffe at Windsor Castle and commissioned the Swiss artist Jacques Laurent Agasse to paint her portrait. The Nubian giraffe shows the curved neck that may have signaled the illness from which she died 2 years later. And the webpage, by the way, of the Royal Collection Trust for their holding of this painting suggests that her keepers there in this image may be trying to coax her to eat and recognizing her illness. The giraffe intended for Austria died too, for reasons that are unclear, and that left Zarafa, who survived to reach France. When Zarafa reached Marseille in 1826, connections between Egypt and France were growing stronger. Bear in mind that Napoleon and his forces had conquered Egypt in 1798 and held it for 3 years. Napoleon had brought along a boatload of scientists, including zoologists. And among these had been Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, whose theories of comparative anatomy vis-a-vis extinct and living species placed him among the precursors to Darwin. His name now graces the street that runs between the Natural History Museum of the Jardin des Plantes, where Zarafa settled, and the Grand Mosque of Paris. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire was so excited about Zarafa that he rushed to meet her in Marseille after a trip to Montpellier, where he had bought for the museum in Paris a set of fish fossils that Joseph Banks had gathered 50 years earlier during the voyage with Captain James Cook in the South Seas. Saint-Hilaire joined Zarafa on the walk to Paris, but he first decided that she needed an outfit to protect her from the elements and to make her look good. Portraits suggest that she was already wearing a Quranic amulet, a gift from Muhammad Ali, which was said to have touched the shrine of Sayyida Zainab, the Prophet Muhammad's granddaughter in the shrine in Cairo. Now she received a raincoat to keep her dry. Made from royal blue fabric and embellished with both the fleur-de-lis and the arms of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the raincoat made her into a walking symbol of Charles X, the French monarchy, and Franco-Egyptian relations. According to Michel Major, a historian of textiles, fitting the giraffe this way also recalled, and I quote, the Ancien Régime ritual of redressing at France's borders foreign princesses who were to marry a Bourbon monarch or an heir to the throne. Like them, she was obliged to leave her country of birth forever, and she belonged henceforth to France, end quote. When Zarafa reached Paris late in 1827, the famous anatomist Georges Cuvier greeted her with his friend, the novelist Stendhal. But the king did not come. Acting on the insistence of his daughter-in-law, Marie-Thérèse de France, Duchess of Angoulême, the last surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who was a stickler for protocol, Charles X insisted that the giraffe come to see him rather than that he go to see her. Zarafa inspired what historians later called giraffomania. Her image appeared on objects ranging from dishes and paperweights to hairbrushes and chimney plates. Bakers made giraffe-shaped biscuits. There was a lady's hairstyle and a men's style of tying cravats named after her, and a yellowish beige color called giraffe yellow, which featured in textiles. And in this image here, you can see the hairstyle and the color of the dress. Artists drew and painted her. I have already mentioned the oil painting in bone. Another artist rendered a watercolor portrait. Oh, and by the way, this was a Guardian article about the crazy giraffe hairdo there. And this is another painting that was done of her. And this one is now in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. So, why did people go gaga? Before she arrived, giraffes had been creatures of legend in France, a marvel because of their outlandishly long necks and reputation as wild but gentle animals. And yet she was again the first live giraffe to reach France. In 1875, the French explorer François Levaillant had shot a giraffe in South Africa and sent its skin to Paris. But French taxidermists were so unfamiliar with giraffe anatomy that they mounted this specimen oddly, as one can see from this portrait on the right, which is in the Jardin des Plantes in its history section today. Levaillant's giraffe was like the famous 1515 woodcut of a rhinoceros by Albrecht Dürer, a best guess made without the living creature at hand. Zarafa was also better than a unicorn, in which belief was waning. In the 1770s, the French naturalist Buffon received a shipment from Leiden in the Netherlands of some giraffe bones and drawings that Dutch explorers had collected near the Cape of Good Hope in the 1760s. Someone had added to the box the tusk of a narwhal, which is an Arctic whale. At the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, Buffon studied the collection, but expressed doubt about whether the tusk went with the giraffe, since the proportions seemed to be out of whack. 29 years later, in 1825, the anatomist Cuvier declared that he had never seen and did not expect to see a living or fossil creature with a symmetrical horn attached to a suture between two bones. While Cuvier doubted that a unicorn was anatomically possible, he could attest from 1827 that Zarafa and giraffes were real. Around the time that Zarafa reached Paris in 1827, 6 Osage people, Native Americans, reached Paris, where they too visited the king before going to the Jardin des Plantes and meeting Zarafa. Their handler, a Frenchman from St. Louis, used the Osage in an ethnological show business that rivaled Zarafa as a crowd pleaser. Their display constituted what scholars have called human zoos, which fortified emerging academic disciplines like anthropology. Meanwhile, critics of Charles X and his regime, including Honoré de Balzac and one of my favorites, François-René Chateaubriand, crafted plays, stories, and songs about Zarafa, sometimes in dialogue with the Osage people, to get across their points while avoiding censorship. Cartoonists portrayed the king as a clumsy giraffe being steered on the road by a priest who was holding his reins. In fact, Charles X, who was deeply unpopular, held the throne for only 3 years after Zarafa's arrival, long enough to authorize a French invasion of Algiers in 1830. One French historian suggested that Zarafa was a Trojan giraffe who stimulated the demons of imperialism by bolstering Charles X's ego and his visions of French imperial grandeur and making the conquest of Algeria seem thinkable. Zarafa died from a lung inflammation on January 12, 1845, at age 20, a reasonable age for a giraffe in captivity. A French historian, Olivier Lagueux, observed that she was cut after her death into pieces, which went their separate ways. It might be more appropriate to speak of the afterlives of the giraffe, he wrote, or rather, the afterlife of the giraffes. To Lagueux, we owe credit for conceiving of Zarafa's story in terms of her life and afterlife, or afterlives, plural. Researchers at the Jardin des Plantes took out her heart, lungs, and other organs and preserved them in formaldehyde, but then lost them. They removed her bones and rebuilt her skeleton, which they later donated to the University of Caen in Normandy in 1869. Her skeleton remained on display there until World War II, when it was destroyed during the Allied bombings. And what you see in these pictures here, it's the Paleontology Museum in the Jardin des Plantes, but it's not Zarafa. It's another famous giraffe skeleton from later. And there you also see the other parts of the collection. The most durable part of her body proved to be her skin, which researchers peeled off and stuffed. Her stuffed form went to a museum in Verdun, where it survived World War I, before moving again in 1931 to the museum in La Rochelle. The fact that the Jardin des Plantes let her skin go in 1869 suggests that as giraffes became more common in 19th century zoos, she herself seemed less special. The 8 stuffed giraffes now displayed in the Natural History Museum in Paris came from Kenya and Tanzania. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and the expansion of steamship and train networks accelerated the transfer of large mammals and reduced the reliance on the Nile conduit. Indeed, in the 1870s, the German trader of zoo specimens, Karl Hagenbeck, procured Sudanese giraffes, but took them to the Red Sea coast for passage through the Suez Canal. The processes that enabled hunters to capture more giraffes for zoos figured in their wider destruction as more Europeans went to Africa to hunt game and as guns proliferated. And recall that when I saw Zarafa in La Rochelle, my reaction is that there were no giraffes in the Sudan. Indeed, giraffes are extinct in the Republic of Sudan today, and very few seem to be in South Sudan, which seceded and became independent in 2011. Giraffe populations were dwindling even when Zarafa was captured. A French geologist who accompanied Muhammad Ali's armies of conquest in 1821 saw giraffes around Khartoum, but reported that they had vanished within a few years from hunting, which is why Zarafa, born in 1824, would have come not from Khartoum itself, but from somewhere probably to its southeast. Following the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of 1898, the colonial regime allowed British officials to hunt for sport and to sell any specimens that they could get, including ivory from elephants. But after World War I, a British South African military veteran tried to contain this process. James Stevenson Hamilton, who later directed South Africa's Kruger National Park, was working in the Sudan at this time. He felt that rifles and modern transport were enabling British officials and British, other European, and American tourists to kill too easily and on too large a scale. Among the worst offenders were men like Winston Churchill and Teddy Roosevelt, who came to the Sudan and later boasted about how much they had killed. In the interwar period, giraffes were still so common in southern Sudan that they sometimes knocked down telegraph poles. But that changed in the late 1940s when a new medicine called anthracite appeared, eliminating the threat of sleeping sickness, trypanosomiasis from mosquitoes, which had historically blocked Sudanese pastoralists and hunters from venturing into swampy areas with big game. Arab horsemen like these began to medicate their horses and started going on hunts that drove giraffes and rhinos to extinction in southern Darfur in the 1950s. In 1958, 2 years after decolonization, the anthropologist Ian Cunnison, who like Mary Douglas did his DPhil with Evans Pritchard here at Oxford, published an article about giraffe hunting among the Homer Baggara Arabs of Kordofan, the region just east of Darfur. And coincidentally, Cunnison was the translator of Marcel Mauss's The Gift, cited earlier for its insights into the role of gifts in forging reciprocal relationships. Homer men told Cunnison that unlike their grandfathers who hunted with spears, they had rifles, mostly French and British guns from the 19th century. They could push deep into what is now South Sudan to kill 3 to 7 giraffes at one go. Giraffes enchanted the Homer. A kind of giraffe mania pervades Homer life, Cunnison observed. The Homer staged divination ceremonies before a giraffe hunt and had an elaborate giraffe meat cuisine. Giraffes were the most popular topic of fireside conversation among men. People told him that they routinely dreamt about giraffes. But Cunnison wondered if this intense interest in giraffes was responding to their depletion, which was already becoming apparent when he was there. Observers spotted the last giraffe herd in Darfur in 1976. And if you look at this map here, the area that I'm talking about first, where some of the first extinctions were registered, is that area bordering the pink and green area on the left-hand side there. So they spotted the last herds in Darfur in 1976. In the 1970s, there were still big herds in southern Sudan. But once civil war broke out again in 1983, sanctuaries and national parks lost funding and staff, hunting went uncontrolled, and firearms sped up the killing. In 1980, an aerial survey counted just over 2,000 giraffes near the southern border with Ethiopia. A report from 2007 suggested that there might be 450 left, while another survey, and I was very excited to find this, from 2023 and 2024 along the South Sudanese Ethiopian border, suggested that there might be small herds or a small herd left. Meanwhile, since the 1960s, giraffes have also gone extinct in Senegal, Angola, and Nigeria. Giraffes are gone but not forgotten. In 2003, 8 years before the breakup that created South Sudan, Human Rights Watch reported on the Khartoum regime's abuses against Dinka and Nuer peoples who were living near southern oil fields. Amidst harrowing details of violence, the report paused to reflect on ecology and wildlife. Traditionally, the Dinka and Nuer, in contrast to the country's Arab pastoralists, had rarely hunted the wild birds and mammals in their landscape. But the names of rivers and towns suggested how important some animals were, such as gazelles, as in the Bahr el Ghazal River, egrets in the town of Mankeen, which is a word meaning egret, and giraffe, as in the Bahr el Zarafa River. Today, it's not clear if there are giraffes along the Giraffe River of South Sudan, although their memory persists in the name. In 2010, as South Sudan stood poised to emerge, leaders set out grand plans. The Telegraph reported that for $7 billion, Juba, the capital, would be redesigned in the shape of a rhinoceros, with a park in its horn and a five-star hotel in its eye. The second largest city, Wau, would be a giraffe, with a large industrial estate in its neck. Another source reported the opposite, that Juba would be the giraffe and Wau would be the rhino, for a cost of $10 billion. Planners may have been looking for inspiration. By the way, here's Boma National Park, where they think they found a few giraffes in the last year, recently. And here we are, Dubai. They may have been looking to Dubai for inspiration, with its man-made islands shaped like a palm tree and a map of the world. But in a country where educational and health infrastructures were so limited that a 15-year-old girl was 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than to be in school, multi-billion-dollar giraffe and rhino-shaped cities were just fantasies. Still, the fact that people suggested the idea at all suggests the power of the giraffe to inspire. As Homer Men told Ian Cunnison in the 1950s, giraffes hovered in people's dreams. This proved true in France as well. Consider a story that the historian Olivier Lagueux recounted about Zarafa's stuffed skin in Verdun during World War I. While some sources speculated that people took her body from the local museum to keep it safe amid the fighting, a report from 1923 advanced a different story. French soldiers found her, this version claimed, when her neck and head were peeking out of the second-floor rubble of the town's blasted museum. They then carried her into the trenches. Lagueux called her the soldiers' saintly relic and improvised Joan of Arc, from whom they awaited a miraculous intercession. Because the giraffe, alive and then dead, exerted a talismanic tug on the imaginations of French people who encountered her, Lagueux called his study of her not a biography, but a hagiography, the life story of a saint. In the late 20th century, other developments kept her story alive too. First, in 1961, a French company introduced Sophie, a rubber teething toy for babies that was inspired by Zarafa but named after Saint Sophia of Rome, who died around 300, and whose feast day coincided with the toy's debut. Sophie the giraffe became not just popular, but iconic, and today is sold in the United States and the United Kingdom also, among parents who like the fact that it is French and presumably chic and made from eco-friendly, natural Malaysian rubber wood. Here's the website of the British official dealer of Sophie the Giraffe. There are many different options, and you can find her for sale elsewhere online as well. And one source boasts that 9 out of 10 children in France today, babies, receive a Sophie at birth. Second, in the 1980s, a retired French journalist named Gabriel Dardot wrote a book about her life, building on research that he had started in the 1950s when he headed the French news agency in Egypt. Dardod was the one who dubbed her Zarafa because the Muhammad Ali era records that he found in Cairo were labeled with that Arabic word, which means again simply giraffe. Third, in 1991, an American named Michael Allen, a self-described fan of the Jardin des Plantes, followed with another very lively book about her. And that book has proved to be very popular. It's one of the, go-to books for people interested in her life story. Works by other authors have appeared since then, translated between French and English, such as Olivier Lebleu's 2006 book on the avatars of Zarafa, which uses a religious metaphor, another religious metaphor, to describe her incarnations. Zarafa's popularity has only increased in this century. In 2009, the city of Marseille installed a giraffe sculpture which doubles as a book exchange repository, with a shelf in her torso where passers-by can donate or take things to read. This sculpture has become such a landmark in one of Marseille's main parks that it has its own French Wikipedia page. In 2012, a feature-length French animated film appeared called Zarafa. With its richly detailed and colored images, creative adaptation of historical events, and vaguely didactic, feel-good quality, this film resembles an American Disney movie, but in a post-colonial French mode that imagines Muslim-Christian and Franco-Algerian harmony. The cartoonists, as I've argued elsewhere, seem to model Zarafa herself on Audrey Hepburn. And I have theories about why that's the case. The Zoo of Lyon followed up on this movie by installing several cartoon panels about Zarafa, who passed through the city on her original journey. And the municipality of Paris's 5th arrondissement, or the Latin Quarter, where the Jardin des Plantes is located, offered public screenings of the film. In 2013, the University of California Press published a lavishly illustrated volume about giraffe physiology, conservation, and history, which includes a chapter called Zarafas, plural, surveying great gift giraffes of the past, including the one that the Mamluks sent to Lorenzo de' Medici. This book positions the chapter on Zarafas, including our Zarafa, between one chapter called Unicorns, and which discusses giraffes as marvels in history, and another called Giraffids, signaling the move towards modern zoological inquiry. This choice confirms the transitional place that Zarafa held during her lifetime between legend and science. In 2020, conservation biologists analyzed mitochondrial DNA from museum specimens in France to reevaluate giraffe taxonomy. Among the 19 specimens they studied, she is the only one with a personal name, as opposed to just a Linnaean subspecies name. They called her the famous Zarafa from Sennar, implying that anyone with giraffe savvy will know her. In 2021, Oxford University Press published a major study of giraffe physiology called How Giraffes Work, in which South African zoologist and veterinarian Graham Mitchell ties Zarafa to the onset of the scientific age in giraffe studies. Meanwhile, in 2023, the British puppeteer Sebastian Meyer built a life-size model of Zarafa and walked her from Marseille to Paris, retracing her route. News outlets ranging from BBC to Le Monde and Figaro covered the story. And here's a beautiful photograph from that of Meyer on that route. And Meyer is now writing a memoir about his experience. And last year, he also did another walk of the Zarafa puppet on behalf of the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. So to conclude, the year 2024 marked the 200th anniversary of Zarafa's birth in the Sudan. She is going strong, and she continues to dazzle. As one in a long line of gift giraffes across history, from antiquity to the 19th century, she traveled from the Sudan into Egypt and onward, attesting to the might of those who owned her and stunning those who saw her. Alive and then dead, she crossed paths with people in settings ranging from Nile barges to a French palace and a World War I trench. She linked Africa to Europe, the Sudan and Egypt to France. She fascinated scientists, fashion designers, painters, soldiers, visitors to zoos and museums, and others. In her afterlives today, Zarafa continues to fascinate while raising questions about the past, present, and future of our more than human world. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for ranging so widely. I mean, you've given us a sort of beautiful and visually dazzling picture of cultural encounter in a specific moment in time in the early 19th century, but you've also managed somehow to package that into a long history of exchanges going back over 1,500 years in such an impressive way that's I think going to give us lots of things to talk about. Now, I know that some of you will have questions, and I'll invite you now to start putting them into the Q&A panel. And while you start getting your thoughts and those begin coming in, I wondered if I could use my position as chair to maybe ask the first question. So Heather, one of the things that you managed to do was, despite the sort of recent history of extinction that you've shown us very vividly in the early 20th century and onwards, you managed to make visible here a set of movements of stuff, of things. And in the first instance, the movement of giraffes, as you say in plural, but also what came through very clearly in some of the images you showed is these caretakers on whom the movement of the giraffe was so necessary. I just wonder if you could start maybe by, because you're talking both about animals and humans and how they relate to each other, if you could start by saying, do we know anything about any of Zarafa's caretakers, or more generally, just about the relationships between Egyptians or Sudanese, their own attitudes towards giraffes within their own traditions?
Actually, we do. And the two caretakers of Zarafa were named Hassan and Atir. And they're very well known as figures. They accompanied her and they looked out for her interests along the way. And if you look at the stylized portraits of her that appear, scholars know that that would be the two of them. One of them stayed for about 10 years, and the other lived for many, many years in Paris, taking care of her. I mean, we don't know much more than that. We just know that we don't even know, by the way, what they called her during her lifetime. You know, as I mentioned, everybody is now calling her Zarafa, but it was Gabriel Dardot who came up with that idea in his book in the 1980s, and we don't even therefore know what they were calling her. So yeah, I mean, I think that's why she may have done so well, because compared to the others, because they did really look out for her and advocate for her over many years.
The act of naming here seems very interesting. I mean, the naming of an animal and how you say this, when and how that started in this case. Do we know anything else about, I mean, you referred to zoos and sort of other forums in which individuals would have viewed these animals in France. I wonder if you can say anything more about contemporary emotions, or was there, mercy shown, any sort of ways of thinking about these imprisoned, in a sense, animals?
So mercy towards her, or her appeal to others.
Yeah, and to her position. I mean, I'm thinking that this is also, and something you've worked on more generally, is the history of slavery and the history of how that fits into the history of empires in this period. And I just wonder whether that act of naming an animal, giving it that sort of identity, almost akin to a person, I wonder whether you've come across any sort of feelings of sorrow for the situation of the giraffe in this period.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when I visited the Lyon Zoo, and I was still getting my mind around her history, and I kept seeing her all over France. Every town I would go to that year, after I went to La Rochelle, I would see giraffe images in many places and in many forms, graffiti on walls in different cities, Strasbourg, Lyon, and elsewhere. And then in Lyon itself, it was really interesting to me. I'm not an expert on zoo design, obviously. I mean, I'm venturing into many different kinds of history here. But it was really striking to me as a visitor to see how the Lyon Zoo actually had walls or areas where creatures could go if they didn't want to be seen. Like there was an effort to give them space, respect their privacy, not have them be on display all the time if they didn't want to be interacting. So, and I see that elsewhere as well, debates over what amount of size is acceptable in a zoo and so forth. These are ongoing debates in zoo design. And again, I'm not an expert, but just as a visitor, I can see that process happening. And then also I'll mention that during the in the Galerie d'Evolution in Paris, where they have a lot of taxidermied animal figures on display. She's not there because they gave her skin away in the 19th century. But there is a room upstairs, and if any of you ever visited the room, it's a very sobering room of extinct plants and animals. And some of the creatures there are among the very last uh, of their kind. There's a quagga, for example, and it's very, very sobering. There's a dodo. And so, yeah, I mean, all of these raise her experience, her life raises questions. And that's part of I think, part of the fascination of her story is people trying to understand what is the appropriate way to respect and interact with the natural world, especially, other humans, non-humans, and plants as well, and
Okay.
waters.
So we have some questions coming in, but I'll just follow up with one last question for you on that, coming out of directly what you say. I mean, you spoke, you know, about the connections between, say, antiquities collectors and animal collectors, and perhaps even
Right.
manuscript and book collectors. This sounds to me like a very interesting world in which the people we tend to think of as just collecting antiquities are also thinking about other biological objects in the way you just described. Is there anything like thinking about the present? Is there anything like attempts to repatriate or bring back any of these extinct animals or specimens back to their original countries?
To bring back the specimens.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any interest of that kind. And you'd have to have interest of that kind. And then you also have to remember the complicated history of Sudan, which I did not have a chance to go into. But Muhammad Ali is a foreign conqueror of the country. So what Sudanese peoples themselves in the area around Khartoum would think about his legacy, there would be mixed feelings about that whole process as well, about that conquest. But you reminded me in your question about something else. There's a wonderful book by a scholar, you might know it. Her name is Doris Behrens Abu Saif. She was at SOAS, and it's about Mamluk. I believe it's about Mamluk gift giving. And what's clear from her book is that the process of giving what we would think of as things, like a great, a fancy jewel, like an emerald or a zebra, they were all part of a similar world of gift giving, and they were marvels and they were trophies. Now, there is that continuity, but your question reminds me of something else that I've been thinking about, which is one really marked difference about Zarafa's experience relative to previous gift giraffes in history, or other gift zebras, or gift, hippopotamuses, or whatever it is that she went on public display. And notice even George IV kept her for himself at Windsor Castle. And even though the portraiture, like the painting that we see, that one that I showed of the Nubian giraffe, it shows the giraffe there with two Sudanese caretakers. I'm not actually sure what their names are. They're not as well known as the two who took care of Zarafa. I'm not sure if they're inspired by that model of, caring for her. But yeah, anyway, these are just some assorted thoughts. But what is different is that she went on public display. It was a post-revolutionary moment. All the other gift giraffes that I know of in history were put out in, like, fancy processions or parades like what Julius Caesar did. But then they were kept in private menageries. So that's something that's different. I just want to point that out because as historians, we're always interested in continuities, but we also want to be attentive to ruptures in history.
So we have a question in from Sebastian Mayer, and picking up on what you said about sort of the treatment and the way these giraffes were treated. He refers to something told to him by Olivier Lebleu about Zarafa's sister, who was sent to George IV in London. And he writes that the Zarafa's sister was transported from the port, riding in a golden carriage, but that it was thought that the lack of suspension on the cobbled roads had caused her to dislocate her knees, and that this might have contributed to the death. And Sebastian wondered whether this is apocryphal, or do we have any evidence of this sort of thing happening, either to the sister or perhaps to others as well?
That's really interesting, and it's very possible because these were the kinds of mistakes that they made. I mean, think about the giraffe that went to Istanbul in 1823. They didn't have enough milk for her. And because you have to take a baby, you can't, experts say you can't capture a grown giraffe. It will resist, it will starve itself. You have to get a baby. But if you get a baby, you have to provide it with milk. So they made that mistake. It actually does not surprise me that she could have dislocated her knees in the carriage, because this story reminds me of another one about what happened to that giraffe that went to Lorenzo de' Medici. He was going to transport it to France, to, what's her name? Anne of Beaujeu, I think is her name. And you know what happened? They stuck her in a barn and she got her head caught in the rafters and it broke her neck. So she died within a few years because they didn't have a building that was tall enough. So these are the kinds of things that happened. And that reflected not that people were trying necessarily to treat them badly, but they really didn't know what they were doing. And the creatures were far more fragile, especially after these long journeys, than they realized. But that other story is really sad
And that
about
seems
the
to be
giraffe that got its head stuck.
about a history of, in a sense, the absence of practical knowledge around animals and what happens when the animal moves, but all that centuries of tradition and usage and husbandry and treatment aren't moving along with it.
Yeah, and by the way, that book, that Oxford University Press book that just came out, I learned one interesting, and learned a lot of interesting things from the book. But one thing that I learned that surprised me is that giraffes, unlike many other creatures, seem to have shorter lifespans in captivity. They live longer in the wild. So zoo life does not seem to prolong them.
Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in. So a question from John Brooke, which goes back to what you told us about gift giving, and wants to know whether the gift of Zarafa had a noticeable impact on the relations between France and Egypt. So maybe you could locate us in that political history and tell us a bit more about what came out of this gift. Did it do
That's
what
a
Mouse wanted it to do?
That's a good one. That's a very good one. So, what got out of it? I didn't have time to mention some of these things. So, at the time that she was arriving, study of like, what is it? Student exchange programs are just starting, like really just starting. The famous case of the Egyptian Rifa al-Tahtawi, whom some describe as the father of Egyptian nationalism. He goes with the first batch of Egyptian students to France, and they're educated there, and then they come back to Egypt, and Muhammad Ali employs them in various ministries, and they have a very significant impact on everything from the translation bureau, that's a famous one, to the medical and veterinary establishment. and so publishing, and so on. So that's one thing that happens. And then later, what happens too is that in the 1830s, when Muhammad Ali tries to occupy Syria and to basically wrest what the Ottoman Empire considered its territory away to form his own empire, the French were supporting him in that venture. And then actually a later chapter in the book, which I, like, this book that I'm writing now, shows what happens in the 1860s. This process continues. I've written a chapter about how in 1863, Napoleon III asks Saeed Pasha, who is Muhammad Ali's youngest son, the one under whom the Suez Canal opened, asks him to loan Sudanese soldiers for the French intervention in Mexico. And I've been writing about the contingent of about 450 Sudanese soldiers of the Egyptian army who are sent to Mexico between 1863 and 1867. So that's another very, I think, tangible consequence of this ongoing history.
Okay. We've got a question about legacies from Edward Morgan. And the question that was asked is, what do you think would be the best legacy for Zarafa today? Would it be to ensure giraffes or giraffe subspecies do not become endangered and or something else?
What would be the best legacy?
Yeah. And I guess maybe that speaks in a sense to maybe your motivation as well as a scholar. And it's just very unique to be bringing together his history, ecology, environmental history in the way that you and many others are doing right now.
Yeah.
Why?
Okay, so I would say one thing that's really striking about this, like there's been so much written about Zarafa, again, as I've tried to show, and that's not even all of it. So there's a lot of fascination with her story in France, but I think scholars have not studied the Sudanese side of the story at all. So the sending side. So what I would hope would be a constructive legacy of my retelling, because I'm reliant on the wonderful scholarship that other people have done and the wonderful, amazingly creative things of artists and things like what Sebastian is doing now and so on. So I'm inspired by all of that. But I think we need to look at the sending country and realize what the cost has been of histories of hunting and animal collecting, and then to take that into account and to try to do what we can to lend support to protect them. Them meaning other creatures like giraffes and other animals, or including birds and plants as well, going forward.
So we have an interesting comment from Dr. Ahmed El-Shehi,
Oh,
who writes, I'm sorry, the functionality on the system only allows people to type into the system. But let me just read this comment here because it was very interesting, especially on that point that you just made about the Sudanese side of the story. He writes that, and I'm reading for him, I collected stories from the settled people as well as from nomads, over 200 stories, and surprisingly, not a single one of them has a story about a giraffe. There are stories about lions, horses, birds, cows, but no giraffe.
wow. That's really sad and telling. And by the way, I'm so honored that Ahmed Ashahi will come. It's been many years since I've seen him, since I've seen you, and I'm really honored that you came. But you know what? That article by Ian Cunnison, it appeared in Sudan Notes and Records, and it's like poetry. It's really sad and it's really touching. And I think he realized as he was writing it that giraffes were on their way out, that the scale of the killing was not sustainable.
We have some other questions coming in about other parts of the world, and I know that you've already brought in almost all of the world, but forgive me if I now take us to other areas as well. Southern Africa, Tim Weiskill asks, have you looked at the giraffes in Southern Africa? They are very major figures in the sand cultures of Southwest Africa, and it provides a reference which we'll pass on to you for sure.
I would love to see that. No, I have not yet done that. I'm in the beginning of my journey of studying giraffes and reading about it, but I would like to know more. And a lot of the greatest ideas and best scholarship has been coming out of South Africa.
A similar question to the Chinese emperors, and whether you've looked at all in the exchange of giraffes, in which the Chinese were linked to Eastern Africa and the gifts that were given to Chinese emperors.
No, I mean, not. I only know about it from that Baron's Abu Saif book on the Mamluk era, where she discusses some of the other marvels that people sent, but not giraffes in particular. But this is a long. I mean, actually, you know what though? If we think about China, the obvious thing that we should be bearing in mind here is what some call panda diplomacy, right? Which is ongoing, and that would be China sending pandas to other countries like the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., but there were many other cases as well of China in the 20th century sending pandas. And scholars have argued that not only should we think about that kind of diplomacy as, not just, in terms of a gift giving in the Marcel Mauss way, but more as what political scientists would call the assertion of soft power.
Mm. How do we relate then, thinking about, I mean, one of the things that came out in a lovely way in your lecture, but also that you've done very well in your work on sectarianism and other places, is the sort of patterns of consumption and conspicuous consumption and material culture that develop around all of these things. And you've started to show us already these amazing engravings and images of Zarafa in its time. Can you speak a bit more about, the way in which giraffes began to fit into a culture of capitalist production and image making and commodities?
Yeah.
The
So first of
giraffomania. Think
all,
of giraffomania as you described.
yeah. So a couple of thoughts there. One is I'm one of the theorists that I cite in the chapter that I'm writing is Thorstein Veblen, the Norwegian American writer who wrote this famous book about conspicuous consumption. I think he wrote it in something like 1896 or thereabouts. So that idea of conspicuous consumption is really striking. And so that comes to mind. And wait, there was something else that you said. What was it about? Could you remind me
Well,
again?
material culture and the sort of printing of the images of the giraffe and
Oh,
the way in
oh,
which
yeah. Yeah,
larger
I had
audiences.
another idea. So one thing that because of time I wasn't able to go into, but there's a fascinating book by a scholar who's at York University in Toronto. And she's, I think, a communications expert. And the book is called something like Virtual Menageries. And it's about the proliferation of images, the consumption of images now on social media and the continuing appeal of images of giraffes or other animals, when people send each other little, Instagram or TikTok videos. So there's that kind of consumption too. And she's asked about what its purpose is, why she's more interested in why people send cat videos. That's her premise. So this is another thing, not conspicuous consumption, but a certain kind of consumption.
Mm.
And she argues that it has this kind of existential element to it of people, which I think is definitely true for the giraffe. And it relates to the fascination that unicorns also commanded over many centuries. But the appeal, the kind of existential primal desire for having access to creatures like a giraffe and circulating images. The what we were talking about with the giraffomania of the 1820s, that's an entire, phenomenon in decorative arts. There are so many examples. Some of them, by the way, for the very rich, but also I've seen, if you look at auction records and things like that, you'll see that it was also it percolated down to the popular level too, not just plates for rich people, but ceramic plates for much humbler set of the population. And I think that has to do with consumption and, consumer culture, but also going back to what this scholar I mentioned, whose name is Jody Verland, what she describes as this consumption of images and the appeal of that.
This recalls something you said about the sort of giraffe as that saintly relic being dragged into the trenches and and something that gets us into the every world of everyday religiosity as well, and thinking about the symbolic, but also perhaps other ways of connecting with the wider world through animals.
Exactly. And I was thinking about, well, what is it about giraffes in particular? Like, why do people feel so strongly about her? She has a fan club page in French too. Like, why her? Why the giraffe? And I think it's because um, the giraffe is also a wild but gentle creature. So I don't think hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses have even the same effect.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, there's another sort of consumption, which I'm reluctant to even ask about, but I'm thinking also about things like, and in the 18th century, of course, in the 19th century, people are thinking more and more about food, and you have worked quite a bit in food history, at least in some of the work that you've been doing right now. I just wonder, is there any thought of the giraffe, in a sort of biological sense, as a source of nutrition, as a source of food?
Well, I think for the Bagara in the region that Hunnison studied, people did depend on giraffe for meat, but they weren't able to get that much of it. It was difficult to hunt with spears, and there were the environmental barriers. And it's really when he says that meat eating just skyrocketed, which is a trend in general in the world. I mean, and we're still, in spite of the fact of growing interest in vegetarian and vegan food, right, which is becoming easier to access, if you actually look at rates of meat consumption around the world, it's gone up hugely in the lifetimes in our own lifetimes too, in variety. And so there was that moment when you saw that with Zarafa, or not Zarafa, with giraffes. I think in the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, it's a testament to that story you tell about extinction and depletion. And I think of Ahmed al-Shahi, the poems that he mentioned, the stories in which the giraffe is completely absent.
Yeah.
And that just says something about, in a sense, how much has changed in that world from where you started us in. If there are other questions, people must be welcome to submit them now. I might ask you, while any last ones come in, um, whether you might reflect for us, Heather. I mean, you're a distinguished scholar who's been working in this field, both Middle Eastern and African history, for a long time. But you're also working in a rather different way in this chapter of the book that you're working on now, specifically the environmental history, the taking seriously what you described at the beginning about animals and animal human history, more than human world. Could you say something, reflect for us about what it's like for you as a scholar, sort of working in these ways now?
I feel kind of that I've let myself be liberated, because I remember when I first told a colleague in Paris that I was thinking about writing about this giraffe. She was incredulous. Like, how could you? Because she was working from the Sudanese history side of things and didn't see how writing about this giraffe in Paris would have any bearing on Sudanese history. And I think, and that's where this global microhistory that you've also written about comes into play. It allows for creativity and asking new kinds of questions. And I have become more and more convinced that a lot of times there are things right in our midst that we just don't ask about. We don't question, but if we did, we'd realize what big issues they reveal, right? So again, this giraffe in a stairwell in La Rochelle, think of how many issues it opens up. Or, following, as I'm trying to do, these Sudanese soldiers who went to Mexico. They only stayed there for 4 years, but trying to rethink Sudanese Mexican history or Egyptian Mexican history, and French Mexican history. I mean, all of this it's just thinking about things in new ways, not staying in our boxes, accepting the fact that we're constantly learning. I'm not a zoo expert. I'm not a giraffe expert, although, as the more that I read, the more I can say about giraffes. And I find myself reading works by veterinarians. I never thought I would do that before. But it's intellectually exhilarating and very productive. And I think it can enable us to write new and better and more exciting histories that can adapt to the needs and concerns and interests of our times. And a lot of times, by the way, I would also say like histories are often hard to detect. You asked a minute ago about meat eating, giraffe meat eating. Nowadays, if you went to Sudan, you wouldn't find anybody talking about a giraffe meat cuisine. It's very easy to forget. And it's very easy to assume that the way things are now is the way they have always been. That's part of the task of the historian. We try to see continuities like we see with this history of diplomatic gift giving, but we also need to ask what is different? What is the same and what isn't the same? Why and what does it mean?
On that note, I'll say, first of all, we've got some lovely comments here, all of which we'll make sure, Heather, that you get from David Bonello and Tim Weisgel, thinking about the several directions in which one might think about this work. Humans as vector species, other examples of gifts of elephants to Portugal in the 16th century. So I'll make sure you get all of these. I mean, the last point that you left us on feels really a very powerful one and a good point to stop and reflect on, which is the way in which your talk has rendered and made visible what is so easily invisible. And I'm thinking again of the sort of story of the giraffe as we may see it in 2024, and how the work that you've shown us has shown the work of recovering a palimpsest of history that is there, but very easily forgotten, and how much of that work you've shown us isn't just about text, but it's about things and actual things, and coming across the corner in a museum and finding something where perhaps the textual traditions that we're used to have forgotten about them. So I think your point about defamiliarizing, in a sense, what seems obvious is really at the heart of any good history. And the second thing that your talk has done so well for us today, apart from bringing back these connections between the Nile Valley and France, but also between animals and humans, is in a sense you've given us a history of surprises and a history of that shows us actually how productive a surprise can be in thinking analytically about the past in a way that might not be obvious to us otherwise. So on that note, we want to just thank you for really a wide-ranging and a lovely talk, beamed around the world, even more effectively than Zarafa herself. So thank you so much, Professor Sharkey, and thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. And I'm sure there are people around the world now join me in thanking Heather Sharkey for just an excellent talk. Thank you very much. And I should advertise finally that we will be having our next Balliol online lecture on Tuesday, the 4th of March, so in about 2 weeks' time. And our speaker then will be Kimberly Johnson, currently the Winan visiting professor here at Balliol College, who will be speaking about the end of Black politics. So do come again and join us in 2 weeks' time for that. And tonight, thank you again, Professor Sharkey, for just a lovely, wide-ranging talk. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.